Brianna. All right. The Culpeper, Virginia chapter of the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, has a new president. And Mr. Kaleb Hackley is the new president of that chapter. Well, let me stop before I even go on. You are the youngest president for any chapter ever for the NAACP. So we want to congratulate you for that. You have experience now as president speaking to the community, and you are planning an MLK Day service for your chapter in early January. So introduce yourself to our attendees, and we will begin our conversation right after.
Oh, well, thank you, ma'am, for that great introduction. My name's Caleb Hackley. I'll lead off by saying, first, I am a child of the Most High. I am a Black man. I'm a kingdom builder and a lover of people. What I will say is my background, I'm a Hampton alumnus. I was able to go to Hampton and study under great prolific thinkers and professors that taught me to question everything that I see and to never compromise my identity or my experience in order to make white spaces comfortable, which is interesting because upon graduation, I then went and started working as a consultant with the DoD, which is very interesting clash of realities. But it gives great insight into specifically what we deal with on a daily basis, dealing with bureaucratic structures and white supremacy being embedded in those. Beyond that, I have done some legislative work at the Virginia General Assembly, doing things such as attempting to reform our policing in this Commonwealth via, instituting review boards, standard use of force guidelines and different things like that, legislative measures to hold our law enforcement accountable, and also try to make sure that they have the equipment they need and the training, the bias training to eliminate and root out white supremacy. So I'm so pleased to be here. I am so honored to be here, and I look forward to spending this time with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much to our guest panelists. If I could, Dr. Uzziah, I'd like to take about 60 seconds to 90 seconds for each of the guest panelists to reflect a little bit on the poem you shared. If we could do that as we go into talking about trial by fire, I think that would add a little more depth to where we're going with this town hall.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So let's start with Dr. Gigi. Your reflections on Dr. Uzziah's poem.
Wow, where to start? Well, first of all, there's a reason why Jesus spoke in parables. Because wasn't everybody trying to hear him? And because when we engage the arts, poetry is the arts, right? When we engage the arts, it engages the brain in a different way. And so certain messages that won't land if you're speaking in a normal conversation or in a lecture or in a speech, they will bypass the normal filters that people block, that the brain and the body will block from hearing. I don't know if those of us who have heard the term cognitive dissonance, but we are constantly engaging, those of us who are on the front lines of justice work, especially race, we are constantly engaging the cognitive dissonance of folk who refuse to embrace and see the truth. And so when you present truths, just dropping nuggets of gold in the framework of poetry, in the framework of allegory or parable, like your book is, it reaches a different place where the resistance, at least in part, the resistance and the filters that will filter it out, their defenses are dropped. And so the way that you have communicated truth in a poem is profound. It's profound. And I love that you started with The very first line had to do with your Blackness and what that means for you as a Black man in the not United States of America, in the anti-United States of America.
Miss Brianna?
So I would undoubtedly echo Dr. Gigi's comments. I'm a poet myself. I just don't publish the work, you know. As Erica said, I'm an artist and I'm sensitive about my, you know, fill in the blank. And so the poem itself was poetic through and through. I think what stood out to me was the repetitiveness, the same way that he started the day, the same way he ends the day, and the same way it's just a continuous cycle. And I think that echoed throughout it in terms of not just the life of this person, whoever this Black man is who's speaking, but also the lives of many Black people, this continuous cycle of oppression, of injustice, of waking up and having to face party struggles and nobody's talking about liberation despite the party, or waking up and having to face, you know, right, you named the statistics of working and unemployment and wages and everything else. And so I think that's what stood out to me, this reoccurring cycle that we're in. And while we're in like this season or this phase where breaking generational curses and things of that nature are popular, right? Thinking about how there are a lot of cycles that are going on within this nation's history. And generationally, everybody is not committed to the collective action of breaking those as well, because that would come with breaking the lives that many people have set up that have benefited off of the Black man's life or the Black person's life. So that's what stood out to me. It's an amazing, amazing piece.
Mr. Kaleb?
I will definitely echo everything that's been said. I would say, to me, one of the key things about the poem was that it exemplified the dichotomy of life as a Black American, and the way that we move through life and the way that we have to consider things that other groups don't have to consider, specifically the aspect talking about when the narrator was talking about driving, right, versus walking, right? Those aren't things that other people who are non-Black usually have to think about. There is no fear of simply getting in the car and driving to work. There is no overwhelming statistic about unemployment that then leaves most of us enslaved to our job, right? There is no overwhelming desire or innate struggle to try to prove who we are, you know, because of the 400, 500-year history of this country dehumanizing us. So I think this poem eloquently captured the fact that, you know, there's just a different life that we live. That comes with a different layer of consideration and thoughtfulness that we have to put into every action that we do. And then even when we attempt to rest, a lot of times it is not true rest. It is a facade that we put up to put ourselves in some sort of peace, when in reality, we are just simply waiting for the next day, the next struggle, the next trial to arise. So I think the poem encapsulated all of that quite beautifully.
Absolutely. You reminded me to beat the light, to be the light. That stood out. Right after this promotional video for this event, and to play it as a segue, we're going to dive into Trial by Fire. And I want to ask a few questions of you, Dr. Uzziah. All right. Dr. Uzziah, your book, Trial by Fire, Deliberations over the Soul of America, reached international bestseller on Amazon in a myriad of categories. I want to talk about that just for a few moments. and then we'll go into a panel discussion that includes our guest panelists. What's a personal reflection on trial by fire that stands out most to you?
So when you look at it, it is set in somewhat of an allegorical format. It isn't your regular social political commentary with a whole bunch of jargon that people really have a hard time digesting and really don't have the time necessarily to go through. It is written in such a way, Dr. Gigi kind of coined it, as Jesus did, in parable-like fashion. I didn't necessarily attempt to bypass people's cognitive dissonance, but I am surely glad that God uses it to do such. It is set as jury deliberations against America. America is the defendant, and the people versus we the people are the plaintiff. And they go through a litany of crimes committed. They go through it not from just a visceral standpoint, not a deeply emotional standpoint, but as you've read, they lay down statistics. They put the evidence down, as young people would say, they got the receipts, and they lay them out so that you can see what their grievances are. Then it is up to the reader to kind of look at and read to the end and decide the fate. There are 12 jurors, right? Given French names, given a Swahili name, given Arabic names, all countries or entities very much involved in the transatlantic slave trade. They are carrying certain dispositions, whether it's Kutajali, who is indifference, or Chuki, who is resentment, or other names, Iman, who is the Arabic priest. All of them have very different perspectives. They are a jury of peers, but they're very different, somewhat dispelling the rumor that Black people think monolithically. I think that too many times we're not given credit for the diversity of thought that we display. There is this belief that we are either all blue or that we're jaded red. There is this thought that we are unable to think critically, that if you put a Black face in front of me, that I'm automatically going to believe that Black face. Where we learned in Kentucky, they said that all skin of mine ain't necessarily kin of mine. Now y'all will catch that on the way home. So what we understand is these diverse perspectives, and yet as I was writing them and they are dialoguing with each other, I recognized every bit of every character in one man, me. And the struggle of African American people as they not necessarily wear all of these faces, but they surely go through on any given day, in any given situation, all of these particular spaces. And the grace of God that allows me to pull back my militancy so that I can push forward my grace, to push back my indifference so that I can bring forth my hope. And it is a miracle that God has allowed us, going through all this tumult, to be able to do that and still be standing to continue to be the conscience of this nation. Because here it is. I've asked this question before, where would America be without the church? Look at the movement, our demand for freedom since the very inception of this country. Had it not been for the strides made in the civil rights movement, Title IX and women's rights and gay and lesbians' rights and any other rights that you might think of, that path would have been so much harder. Before there was ever suffrage, there was the 15th Amendment. And so we have to understand that we have been, for whatever reason, I call it divine, the conscience of this nation. And if we want the conscience to be pricked, then we have to, in fact, stand up. We have to voice our concerns, and we have to be adamant about holding people accountable, holding feet to the fire so that change can be made. What did our friend Frederick Douglass say? Power concedes nothing without a demand.
Absolutely. the book is in depth. It's so much that could be discussed at this time. But I want you to summarize, if you can, some of the transformative nature of this book and what it's done through some of the readers' reviews that have been given, some of the testimonials that you've heard, and the possibilities of what it can do in our community and nation at large.
So part of what I hoped for was a real reckoning and conversation. The gathering, the intellectual space, the authentic sharing of perspective with a desire to see change. I think that too many times when we have these conversations in the spaces that we have these conversations, that these conversations are too often sanitized. And when you attempt to have these conversations that really require candor, that really require assertiveness, and you attempt to sanitize it, that you lose something in it. I firmly believe that we can be respectful, we can be civil, yet at the same time be assertive and extremely candid. And so what I hoped for was something that gave honor to our ancestors, that gave honor to my present day brothers and sisters, that gave honor to the multiplicity of perspectives that we have across this nation, with the hopes that my non-melanated brothers and sisters would hear, and instead of walking in a state of what can sometimes be viewed as chosen comfort or quite simply opportunistic ignorance. You know, I don't have to go over across the street and face that, so let me stay on my side of the street and continue to live in a sense of comfort. I was hoping that we would hear that and move from that. What did we see during the emergence of what we now know as the Black Lives Movement on the heels of Mr. Floyd? We saw young Black people, we saw young white people, we saw young atheists, we saw young LGBTQ, we saw young Hispanics, we saw young Democrats, we saw young Republicans, we saw old, we saw the convergence of intergenerational activism that many people from many different parts of this country were saying to themselves, I no longer want my country viewed this way. I no longer want to live in this type of America. I see the need for change. I see how detrimental this problem has become, and we are not going to allow it. And I think that is, I hope, the most transformative statement that this book makes, right? We are on a time schedule. We are on a time schedule. Famed Scottish historian said that there are some 200 years or so in the cycle of a democracy, right? We are in the stage of a democracy where we've moved from bondage to faith, moved from faith to courage, move from courage to freedom, move from freedom to abundance, now moving from abundance to selfishness, and then selfishness to apathy. The last stages of a democracy is apathy transformed into tyranny and bondage again. And I think America very much finds herself in a place of apathy. And if we allow apathy to cause us not to stand up at the polls, if we allow apathy to cause the disintegration of education, if we allow apathy to allow folks who are not representative of the whole, listen, a friend should not be speaking for our entire America. Unless they are representative of all of America, we need to quickly, with expediency, with force, let these people know this is not what America is about, and then be what America is about. Otherwise, we will find ourselves, all of ourselves, in bondage again. We can't keep asking America to bless God and not follow God and expect God not to come see about us.
Wow. Amen. In the comments, I just want to read a couple of comments because they are coming through. I'm not sure if many of the attendees can see these, but Ryder Williams says yes. Kayla Lightfoot says facts. Dr. Gigi is even chiming in, say that. Janae Wilson, so with extra O's, good. So what you're saying is resonating with our attendees and those that aren't here that may even watch the replay. I know that it speaks to the hearts and minds of our people and people of other races as well who are tired of what America has produced thus far. Let's go ahead and begin our panel discussion because I want to let the attendees know a little bit about the overall theme for this evening. Dr. Uzziah planned for this town hall to discuss the economic, theological, and social ramifications of a nation's original sin. So on that theme, can you speak a little bit to maybe the economic or theological or social ramifications, Mr. Kaleb, as far as America's original sin?
Oh, where to start?
Exactly.
So our original sin, of course, is the sin of slavery and the hypocrisy that began from the moment we broke away from the British yoke, right? The statement of all men are created equal when millions were still held in chains and denied basic human rights has continued to resonate and translate now. There's a reason why we as a people are usually the last hired, first fired. There is a reason why home ownership for our demographic is the lowest of all demographics in the United States. There is a reason why we are more likely to die both nonviolent and or violent ways in this country. And it is because this entire system was designed off the back of the dehumanization of Black folks. And the entire economic system that is currently in place, the foundation of it is American slavery. I was reading about, I think that the top 5 financial institutions that exist in the world all have some root and tie back to slavery, right? A lot of the collateral that was used to build these institutions were Black bodies, Black blood, right? A lot of the houses that were built, a lot of the lineages that were established through the exploitation of Black individuals. And then this doesn't even start to touch, the deeper, more social aspects of American life, right? We could talk about voting, the franchise, which is a basic tenet of citizenship. It's a basic right of citizenship. We were denied it for years. We weren't even considered citizens at one point, right? All this goes towards our economy, right? And we understand that everything, politics is simply who gets what, when, at what time. Politics is entirely about resources. Resources make up the economy, right? So everything leads back to the economy. That's the number one thing any politician will ever say, right? Whenever they're running for office, it's always about the economy. I think Bill Clinton had that in his campaign room when he was running for president. But our entire experience tied to that economically, that original sin has put us at a disadvantage. It's almost like having 400-pound blocks while trying to sprint a 100-yard dash, right? Everybody else is taking off. We have to struggle with an additional 400 pounds of weight that aren't of our own design. Theologically, though, I will say that we can see this now, especially in the last 10 years, I'd say. We have Christianity and we have American Christianity. They are not the same. The God that is referred to so much by American politicians and American institutions is really American deism. It's a civil religion. They're not talking about Jesus of Nazareth, right? They're not talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? And they can't possibly be talking about him because they don't live his values. The institutions of our nation don't resonate with his glory. They don't give off his compassion or his love. And for too long, we've watched religious institutions, specifically non-Black religious institutions, give cover and provide, manipulation and gaslighting against Black and brown people by excusing the original sin of slavery and only focusing on forgiveness. But there can truly never be any reconciliation without repentance. And you can't repent without telling the truth. So we can never theologically start to even attain that which we say that we strive for if we don't start by telling the truth. So I hope I stayed within the frame of the question and gave a little bit of my perspective.
Yes, I love that. And before you end, as legislative aide to Virginia's Senator Locke, can you talk a little bit about what you've seen across the board politically? Because you mentioned that just a little bit as it relates to what we're talking about and how America has treated Black and brown citizens.
I will say, in my experience with working on Dr. Locke's staff, and I want to be very, very clear, Dr. Locke is a Black woman through and through, powerful, intelligent, fearless, determined, and one of the greatest mentors I've ever known. There were some challenges we confronted when trying to pass legislation, even within our own caucus. And Senator Locke is the chair of the Senate Democratic Caucus in Virginia. Dr. Harris used the term opportunistic ignorance. I use a different one. I say weaponized ignorance, right? The thought process of, even amongst the Democrats, which is supposed to be the more, understanding political party, the more amenable political party when it comes to liberation, there is a deliberate weaponization of ignorance, saying things such as, oh, well, we solved that in the 60s. That's why we marched. That's why we protested. That's why all these different things happened. And saying that there was, the more urgent priority was saving our democracy from Trumpism. And even ignoring, the basic plight of the Black person, right? You can't say that you want a more fair society and we don't address the root cause of unfairness in this country. You can't say that you care about being progressive and making a society more just if you don't talk about the root injustice of this nation. And it was really a master course in understanding how people's interests a lot of times can trump their commitment to truth and their commitment to true reconciliation, right? I want to, use this office as a platform to do something else, right? But you don't want to do the actual work of making the Commonwealth everything that it says it should be for Black folks, white folks, everybody, right? And it's very telling. You can look at there's 2 vacancies that are opening up in Virginia's congressional delegation. And so many state legislators are jumping into that race. And a lot of them, during my time with the General Assembly, chose to vote and or to work specifically on how will this advance my career? They may not have said it, they may not have explicitly wrote it, but a lot of their thinking was framed on how do I get reelected and how do I set myself up to succeed into this higher office, which is very telling. And sure enough, as soon as a higher vacancy became apparent, they all jumped in the race. So it is very clear that they didn't necessarily make votes or negotiate in good faith or off of conscience, but off of self-advancement to a degree. Now, these people aren't bad people, but good people can still make bad choices. And I think that's the plight, especially in government, that Black people, brown people have faced for generations, right? Flawed people making bad choices, right? And choosing, instead of dealing with the root cause, to put it off for the next generation to fix, because hopefully the next generation will be better than us, and the next generation will get it right rather than us just putting our hands to the plow and doing our part now. So that's the context that I see from my legislative experience, and specifically our Black experience in this country, specifically in the Commonwealth.
Thank you for that. Dr. Gigi, theologically, based on your education, being an intellectual, being a mom even, how have you seen it affect families, what America has done across the board here in the States?
Yeah, I think before we can even talk about how it has affected families, I think we've got to go back to where it started, because actually we in the United States in particular, and in the Western world in general, we accept modern day Western Christianity as Christianity. And as my brother Kaleb has just spoken of, it's not. They're not one and the same. And most of us do not know that there is a dramatic, a profound dividing line. And most of us don't. When you mention 1492, most Americans will say, oh yeah, that's when the explorer Columbus sailed and discovered North America, when actually not only was Columbus clearly not an explorer, he was actually a colonizer. He was a leader of the occupation that occupied and murdered and attempted to commit genocide. That was Columbus. But what most people also don't know is that also in 1492, the same year that the chief colonizer sailed, the papal bull was written. The papal bull is a document written by the Pope at that time, declaring in the name of God that anyone coming from their neck of the woods over there in Europe, who enters a land with folk who do not appear to be believers in their westernized Catholicism, it gives people the right, not only the right, but actually the invitation and the calling backed by God, decimate the people and to steal their land. Which means that the chief colonizer, leader of the occupation, came here in the name of God, along with his entire cohort, in the name of God. So what we know today as the United States of America, from the very beginning, before its even inception, it was always about conquest. It was always about thievery. It was always about raping the land just as much as it raped the people. That's what this experiment always was about. And that hasn't changed. That hasn't changed. We just put a stamp of God, Bible, religious freedom language to cover it up. So the concept of race, the construct of race didn't actually even exist until the late 1600s.
There it is.
It didn't even exist until the late 1600s. The idea of a racial hierarchy was not, it certainly wasn't codified in law, but it wasn't even a construct as of yet. It was just take whatever bodies we have the physical capability to overpower, force them into slavery so that we can become wealthy and powerful. And initially, that was the indigenous. That was our First Nation siblings. We murder them, those that we don't murder, we steal their land, and we force them into servitude, indentured servitude. Now, of course, the indigenous folk knew the land because they were the first stewards of it. So yes, there was a decimating of the indigenous people, and there was an enslaving of the indigenous people, but it wasn't nearly as effective as the colonizers and the occupation needed to gain the wealth and the power that they wanted, that they envisioned. So that's when we decided, I'm saying the proverbial we, in the spirit of collective responsibility, we went over to the motherland and began thieving beautifully melanated bodies from African soil of the motherland. just because we can. And we enslaved millions of them. We murdered millions of them. We raped and brutalized and dehumanized millions of them. It was only over 100 years later when a small group of folk rose up, actual Christian folk, rose up and said, wait a second. If we believe in this God, how can we be enslaving other human bodies? It was then that the colonizers and the occupation said, wait a second, we've got to literally construct a religion and a theology that endorses, that justifies the enslaving of human bodies. That is the birthing place of what we know as Western Christianity. There's a reason why our dear brother, Frederick Douglass, called it the slaveholders' religion. This ain't following Jesus. This is the slaveholders' religion. That is the root. That is the root, the core, the heartbeat of what we call today Christianity in the Western world. It really ain't about Jesus of Nazareth, because Jesus of Nazareth was a brown Palestinian on the land of Africa. Come on, somebody. So what we actually have today, the faith that we inherited today, is a religion that created a God. It manufactured a God. It manufactured a systematic theology that endorses and justifies anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. Therefore, of course, the Christianity we inherited is a God who endorses colonizing, thievery, conquest, rape of the land, rape of the people. That's the God of Western Christianity. But that ain't the God of brown Jesus from Nazareth, who was Palestinian and murdered by the state. So that's the faith that we have inherited. And until we begin to do, collective we again, until we begin to do and are committed to doing the decolonizing of our faith, of our God, of our Jesus, of our communities, we will continue to perpetuate the slaveholders' religion. Now, to go back to your question of me, Ms. Christina, how does that impact our families? Well, dear God, that is why I have spent the last 25 years of my life not just doing justice work, but doing healing work. The healing of intergenerational, intragenerational, and transgenerational racial trauma. Because it is so profound, and that trauma is passed down in our physical bodies, in our DNA. We know that from science, and we know for a fact that at least, it could be more, but we know at least 14 generations, trauma can be passed down for at least 14 generations. Now look here, I did the math. I multiplied 14 generations by the number of years that we consider a generation, family, siblings. That takes us back before the transatlantic slave trade even started. So both the trauma as well as the extraordinary resilience are both being carried in our DNA today and are expressing themselves both through our lives, because it's still alive in our DNA, right? So you talk about the impact on our families, on our Black and brown families. That trauma is being passed down and passed down and passed down and passed down. And so is the resilience. We can't forget that. So is the brilliance. So is the ability and the commitment to create. You talk about artists, to create under the most unspeakable conditions, to thrive, to influence in such a way that the rest of the world wants to mimic and steal what you created because it is that brilliant, but then just not claim you as the creator.
That right there.
So the last thing I'll say theologically, Western Christianity has divorced the gospel from its birthing place. Its birthing place is Africa. So we get taught, don't talk about ancestors. That's not biblical. Really? Hebrews 11, the great cloud of witnesses? Hold on a second. The whole Old Testament talks about he slept with his fathers and his mothers, right? We poo-poo on the drums. You know, my African-American studies professor used to say, with regard to leadership, the poo-poo rolls down the hill, right? But that's what's happened to our theology and our gospel, but most of us don't know it.
Yes. That's good.
I love how you addressed resilience, brilliance. I mean, just that has a ring of its own. And it brought to mind the resilience and brilliance that we continue to carry. So I'm glad you touched on that, because we don't talk about how our ancestors circumnavigated the world before any of those things began. And my family in particular, with just a little bit of research I did through Enoch Pratt Free Library, like most free libraries, they have sections where librarians will go through documents with you and research names and things like that with you, if any of the attendees or any of you are interested in that. I did that for a very brief time and found out my people were here. So some of my people were here from both my paternal and maternal sides of the family. So we have such depth. We are a people who are rich with not only knowledge, wisdom, expertise, creativity, imagination, and all of those things, but we have spirit that doesn't die. And we have what you spoke about, Dr. Gigi, that which is passed down within our very DNA. So I am getting chills. Miss Brianna, speak to the theological, economic, or social aspects of what we're talking about, and the thoughts that stand out most in reference to what we've been discussing so far.
Okay, so the best thing a leader, a speaker could do is sometimes know when to just do the snaps to the people who have already spoken. And so Kaleb and Dr. Gigi have hit the nail on the head in terms of, and I say this all the time, Yahweh is not America's God. America is America's God. It is the epitome of idolatry, of self, and self-gratification. And so that's the theological implication. But if we take it a step further, you are claiming a God whom you do not know. But let's say you're claiming Yahweh. You will then have to be under the judgment of Yahweh as a result. And I know Dr. Harris spoke to this earlier in saying, right, like you want the blessings, you want America to God to bless America, but you do not want the judgment of God. And so when we consider that, the first things that come up for me is much of what Kaleb covered already, which is that elements of repentance. And I remember, I'll never forget, it was a 2020 protest in Culpeper, and somebody had a sign. And it was the quote that we see from Genesis 4, if I'm not mistaken, where God tells